Hello, everybody, and welcome to the sixth in a special series of podcasts discussing Cox Automotive and Grant Thornton's Insight Report. I'm Philip Nothard, Insight Director at Cox Automotive, and I have the pleasure today being joined by Chris Green, founder and CEO of Regit. Hi, Chris, how are you?
Yeah, I'm great, Phil. Thanks very much for having me on. Much appreciated.
2024 very clearly started.
Absolutely, yeah. A little bit of a slow start. I'm not sure how volatile it's going to be this year, but we're definitely expecting a bit of volatility, I think, aren't we? Certainly in our industry.
Yeah, definitely. So in this series, we'll be discussing the topics and headlines found in the recent Insight Report, which you can read at the Cox Automotive website. In this podcast, we will focus on the retail sector, highlighting the changes and changing consumer habits and the ways retailers can capitalize on these changes and adapt their retail operations. So, Chris, you sit firmly within that retail consumer space. So let's start off a little bit. And you and I are friends in the friends anyway, and friends in the social space. So I'll start off with a fairly big question here. I mean, given the deadline around the banning of the ICE vehicles, it's been now pushed back to 2035 from 2030, extended obviously back in September of last year. I mean, what trends and perspectives are you now starting to see emerging in the sector as a consequence of this change?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think depending on who you are, whether you're a business like ours, a car buying customer, a dealer, or an OEM that's heavily invested early versus some of them that haven't. I think they've all got a different opinion. I think they've all got a different view on it. But I think certainly what I have noticed is obviously there's certainly a pause on EV investment. We've seen the likes of GM pause in EV investment and several other manufacturers. We've seen the likes of Ford, who've probably gone a little bit heavier than most, being completely unhappy about it, which you can understand. I think you've seen a lot of dealers breathing a bit of a sigh of relief, if I'm completely honest. They all sort of thinking, oh, we've got a little bit more time. But you've then also got the ZEV mandate, which is going to put some pressure on when you need 22% of zero emission vehicles. But some trends I have seen, and interestingly, certainly from an EV perspective, you've seen manufacturers now start to discount EVs. You've seen used cars depreciate, certainly in EV, significantly. But I think on the new car, from an OEM perspective, I'm starting to see brands now, certainly Volkswagen doing, reverting back to type, reverting back to 0% PCP, which we didn't see 12, 18 months ago. My FD, James Fawcett, has just bought an ID Buzz, £65,000 car for £336 a month with 3 payments down over the next 2 years. 12 months ago, that car was a 2-year waiting list and no discount. So, we're starting to revert back to type now. Obviously, we know what works historically, things like pre-reg vehicles, OEMs pre-regging, dealers pre-regging. We're starting to see a load of that again. I think we're going to see more. So for me, the trends that I'm seeing is from where we were going down agency model, no discount, EV investment, we're now starting to revert back to type a little bit, which is effectively moving metal, which we need to do. And dealers will do that by hook or by crook.
And thinking about the consumer space, I mean, you sit in that Regit data, so you're seeing the activity through the Regit garage in terms of activity, and you've got your EV section on the garage. What is the data, or what's the latest data that you can see around what is the consumer's attitude, the public attitude towards EV buying, selling and pricing of EVs now?
I think it's still fairly similar and still fairly the same as it's been. It does tend to shift up and down a little bit in terms of consumer sentiment. And you've seen that, Phil, when we provide the data for the autofocus reports. But in short, from a consumer perspective, certainly they don't feel like they're in such a rush to buy an EV now. There's a little bit more breathing space, if you like. I think that infrastructure is still the big one. We've just seen over the last couple of weeks that the government has missed the target for a certain amount of percentage of fast chargers that need to be in the UK, right? So, we're missing targets. It's not helping the customer. It's not helping adoption. They're a little bit more relaxed, I think. They're still happy to now buy an ICE vehicle, whether that's new or used. Obviously, EVs are cheaper in the used space, and I think they're set to drop again, as we've been reading over the last couple of days. So I do think that we will see an adoption in used EV, but not necessarily an adoption in new EV. I think some of the brands that are more around the price point will do well. So I think your BYDs are going to do pretty well. Obviously, we've seen the likes of Hyundai and Kia over the last few years doing quite well on the models that they offer in EV and the price points. But I think there's some manufacturers are certainly going to struggle because there's just not that momentum yet. But we are in a lull. We are in a pause. I do genuinely think that it's not that EV is dead by any means. That would be a ridiculous statement to even come up with that, even though there's some of the media rags right in that. We're in a lull. We're in a pause. I think EV adoption will be more around the used car space now. I think infrastructure does need to get better. There's definitely sentiment from our consumers, from our data, that they are saying it's just not good enough for where they live or how they operate their lives. And there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, so I think it is, as you say, the work is happening in terms of the new vehicle supply space, in terms of that cost of entry point, with the new entrants away from the legacy operators, etc. Whether it's too soon with the ZEV mandate, the 22% is too quick, too soon. We know that EV adoption is really being driven by the fleet sector and not necessarily by the private sector because of salary sacrifice and things like this. And there's nothing really there for the consumer. But I think, getting back to the data a little bit, and we talk about getting the data right and how important it is for the sector, and whether that's understanding around EVs, whether that's understanding of consumer behaviors, consumer demand. How important is it now for data to be right, and even for those smaller dealerships that may never have got involved with any real data to understand consumer habits, consumer activity within the classified and lead generations and things like that? I mean, how important is that data now across the dealer network?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of the two, both the OEM and the dealer group, and the OEM supporting their dealers. And I think retention is key. I think that, harnessing data, looking at the data that you've historically held, how up to date is that data? Can they contact them by email? Can they contact them by phone? And more to the point, if you look at dealers who've had a history of consumers in their localized areas buying cars, I think it's time to revisit them, but revisit them even more so. Even if they're not necessarily buying, I think it's really important that they focus on retention, getting them back into that dealership for whatever they need, nurturing them, giving them a better experience, and just effectively making sure that if they're not selling as many cars at this moment in time, that there is a big retention play. Certainly from a manufacturer perspective, data is key for those guys, right? We all know that lapsed owners are a big problem for an OEM. So if lapsed owners are a problem for an OEM, that falls downstream. It's a big problem for dealer groups, certainly the larger ones. And I think identifying lapsed owners in the vehicle car park and getting them back into the dealer network is absolutely key for retention. I really do.
And you mentioned in there about user experience, and you often speak about that user experience within that link between the retailer and the consumer. How can dealerships improve what they offer? This now, whether it's, we talk about this shift from virtual to physical or blend of both, and it all sits with that user experience. What do the dealerships really need to start to think about to improve that now?
Do you know, it's a really great question, a really good question. I've thought about this a lot recently, which is almost like, how do they carry on doing what they're doing and doing well, which most of the time they do, but how do they pivot a little bit? How do they innovate? What can they do that's a little bit different, certainly around EV, I think. And I think that for me, dealers should be focusing on becoming a little bit more event-based. Now, I'll talk about that shortly, a little bit more event-based and offering more of an experience, certainly in the localized area. And I think for me, they've got these wonderful glass palaces, right? They've got a lot of them. They've got these fantastic glass palaces where they've got all this space. They've got parking facilities for people for events. And I think what they should be doing is maybe looking at how do we engage with the local community around EV? How do we engage with our historical data? What sort of events that we can we put on which are informative, content-based, educational, where effectively what they're doing is they're allaying fears around EV and buying one. And I think that for me, nurturing those users in their local community where they've sold them cars historically, family, friends, I think putting on events and being almost like educational authoritative in terms of a voice around EV and allaying those fears. And I think for me, if they can be a little bit more event-based and a little bit more content-based and a little bit more educational-based, I think that'll stand them in really good stead for the future.
So you think it is more now that making sure that, because we talk a lot about EVs, we talk a lot about agency model at the minute, we talk, there's a lot going on in the sector, but fundamentally, we in the UK, we're going to be a 7.5, 8 million used car market. We're going to be a 2 million new car market, and it's going to be about where those customers buy their cars from and what they buy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as we know, we've got new entrants to the market. As we know, there's more coming, as we're all reading. Some will consolidate, some won't even make it here, and some will just decide to rely on the current dealer infrastructure, like the likes of BYD, etc., as we've seen with the fantastic showroom that's in Mayfair. And I've been to an event there in Mayfair at one of the, and it was a phenomenal event. It really, really was. And it was really educational and really informative in a wonderful location. And I think that's what dealers have got. And I think when you talk about agency model, if you're going to go down the agency model route, it's all going to be about the customer experience. And you're going to buy that car at no discount, whoever gives you the best experience, the best service, whether that's event-based, and it needs to be memorable. It needs to be memorable because, and talking about trends, we're also seeing a pause in agency model as well, right? Everybody's delaying that. I think that the two are linked. I think actually moving the ICE ban to 2035 and EV probably not becoming, pausing, and the lull that we've got there in terms of adoption and uptake. I don't think it's a coincidence that some manufacturers have gone, okay, pause the EV investment and pause the agency investment, and let's revert back to type and just sell some metal. Yeah, that's really what it's about. And I think that experience for me is going to be absolutely key moving forward for customers, certainly in terms of where they buy their cars from.
And you mentioned there about competition. We know it's competing for consumers' attention now more than ever. It's getting more competitive out there in the marketplace, whether that's by OEM or by retailer representing those OEMs in the new or used vehicle space. I mean, thinking about advertising, it's reaching new customers, we know can be challenging. Getting that new conquest business into the business, that customer. Thinking about that dealer around advertising, what should dealers be thinking of if they could focus on one thing or improve something around advertising to stand out from their competition, to be a little bit different, to get that new customer into that? What should they be thinking about now going forward?
$1 million question, right? A tough one to answer. I think it's a combination of everything we've talked about, really. I think they should go and just get back to full page adverts in the local papers.
That's double page spreads. Yes. Yeah.
Hey, why not? Why not?
Probably a bit cheaper than they used to be, possibly now.
Cheap as chips now, by the way. Cheap as chips. So, no, I think they've got to have a complete omni-channel approach, right? As well, I think the omni-channel approach. I think the way that they retain and acquire users to the website. I think making sure that the content that they're putting out there is informative, it's educational. And again, advertising your business. Now, what does advertising your business mean? Well, if you look at Tesla as an example, that they will tell you that they've never done any advertising, but yet they sent a car into space. That's advertising, that's marketing, yeah? They'll tell you they don't do marketing, they don't do advertising, but they do stuff which is completely off the charts. Now, obviously, we're not expecting dealers to send cars into space, right? But I do think it is about how can we be a little bit more innovative? How can we engage Gen Z a little bit more, the next generation of car buyers, right? Which is effectively do they want to really go to the dealer? Maybe, maybe not, but do they want something that's a little bit more event-based? I think influencers, major influencers for dealer groups that can afford them would be a real asset to them. And we are starting to see some of the bigger dealer groups do that now, as we've seen. And I think that's definitely a place for them to start to be a little bit different is, how do we get our business out there? How do we showcase we're a little bit different? How do we educate? How do we become informative? It's not just about, spending a load of money on Google. They're already doing that, right, in terms of paid search. It's not about, investing money in SEO, completely saturated market, expensive and really difficult to do now, especially with the algorithm changes that Google do every sort of like 3 or 4 months. But I think for me, it's how do you stand out in the crowd and do a little bit something different? I've been on a couple of Polestar driving events. I actually really like what they do. When you go on one of them events, they're informative, they're educational. I've never forgotten it. It stands out for me. I really like the Polestar brand on the basis of the events that they do. Genesis doing similar ones, yeah. Test drive events. Do you know what I would try to look at if I was a dealer? Visiting customers on their home turf, home test drives, whether that be new or used. How do we become a little bit more friendly? How do we make the customer feel that it's a little bit more on their terms? I can guarantee you that conversion into sale from test drive at home, would be far higher than conversion in the showroom. Granted, there'll be more test drives taking place in the showroom. But I think if there's any way that there could be more of a home service where customers are feeling a little bit better, a little bit more friendlier, safer on their own turf. I think home test drives and things like that work in really good ways.
And just segueing back to EV, do you think that's possibly a way to think about that EV? Because, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about range anxiety. Now, there are a lot of EV drivers that once they get an EV, many of them just love the drive and the experience of that EV in the main. The bit that does let them down is that charging infrastructure, the range and things like this. Is it a case that actually we need to think about that consumer, the private sector? Is it that actually we've just got to get the experience? We've got to get people, like you say, with that Polestar test drive days, pure electric vehicle in the pop-up, in the malls and the centres there and the test drive events and things like that. Is it a case that to get EVs into that private consumer that isn't looking at it from a tax benefit or a benefit in kind benefit, or because their company's gone to 100% EV fleet, is it a case of experience it, really drive that vehicle and see where the infrastructure where you live actually
100%.
does suit your behaviours? Because we talk a lot about range anxiety, but the average mileage in the UK is between 6,000 and 8,000 miles a year, and the distance people are driving is a lot shorter. So it's, is it a case that it's this perception against reality of this EV space?
Yeah, I think that dealer groups almost have to sort of have a bit of a different mentality. It's almost like, how do we become full service? How do we become the authoritative voice? How do we become more educational? If you, as an example, if you get a customer on the phone and you're desperately trying to get them down to the showroom to drive an EV, and it's like, well, I'm not sure about the infrastructure and I'm not sure about where I live. Imagine a salesperson or an experienced advisor going, and I'm not just talking new or used now, because one of the biggest problems that we've got with new EV is demonstrators, right? That's one of the biggest problems we've got, because, you've got dealer groups who will go, we're not going to have a demonstrator here for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or whatever it is. So I think the OEM has got to get the finger out when it comes to demonstrators. They've got to make sure that their dealer groups that are paying for these franchise agreements have got as many of the makes, models that are either out or due to come out in the next 2 or 3 months. You've got to make sure that these customers are able to drive these cars, see them, touch them, feel them. But imagine an experienced advisor, as we might call them in agency model, or a salesperson as we know them as today, just flipping the conversation and going, why don't I bring this used EV to you and have a look at your house for you? And what I will do as well is I'll just have a look at the general area and I'll see where your nearest charging points are for you. And then what we can do is we can have a drive to your nearest charging point, and I'll show you how to charge it. How many miles a week do you do? Oh, you're only going to need to charge the car once every 3 weeks. Yeah. Do you think that conversation's taking place from a salesperson to a potential EV buyer on the phone? I'm not sure it is.
Let them drive to work in the vehicle and experience that daily journey. And
100%.
Yeah.
They've almost got to become full service. They've got to become the experts, the absolute experts is what they've got to come. And you know yourself that as much as they do a lot of stuff right, are they really innovating? Are they really changing? Are they changing the conversation, and are they changing the perception? I'm not so sure they are, really. And I think that they have to look at how they innovate. Certainly the smaller dealers in more of the rural areas, right? They've probably got the time. They've probably got the ability. They probably know the person who's ringing up on the phone. They've probably got an existing relationship with them. Yeah, it's a little bit like, I suppose, putting the Jim Reed, into EV education, into EV buying is a little bit of, I think, of how I would describe it. Yeah.
No, I mean, there's a lot of food for thought with that. So I mean, it's I think there's I think right at the offset we talked about 2024, and it's going to be an interesting year, without doubt. It's going to be an interesting time of change, whether that's around new vehicle supply, transition to EV, transition to agency, or this full change of adoption, the way we sell cars, the way consumers engage. To your point, how we advertise and how do we reach those customers in the new world? How do we engage with those new customers, those conquest customers? How do we work with them? So lots to think about. I mean, I knew we'd probably come away from this conversation, Chris, with more questions than potentially answers with some of this, but I mean, as always, it's a great pleasure chatting to you, and really appreciate you giving up the time today and chatting to you through some of this. But I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about what's happening in this space as the year progresses.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks very much, Phil. Really enjoyed it, and happy to give my 2 penneth when I can.
Well, thanks for listening to the 6th in our new series of Insight Report podcasts. We hope you enjoyed our discussion today, and you're sure to join us for the next episode. For now, you can read more about what we've discussed today in the Insight Report, which is available at coxautoinc.eu. That's coxautoinc.eu. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll speak to you again soon.